to go?
Catering.
Okay, we'll call our meeting to order. Roll call, please, Renata.
Here.
Gookin.
Here.
Miller.
Here.
English.
Here.
McEvers.
Here.
Eddinger.
Here.
Evans.
Here.
Scott, would you
And-
call a roll call for your group, or are you just going to
We're
say
just going to
present?
call the meeting to order for the Urban Renewal Agency.
Okay, so we are
Hit it.
here today for a joint workshop with Ignite CDA and the City of Coeur d'Alene. And we will start it off. We have Phil Boyd, who's going to be the leadoff hitter here.
Batting average is?
1,000.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jeff has instructed me to stand here, and so I feel trapped, and I'm not used to standing behind, but I'll do what I'm told. So tonight, as the mayor mentioned, we're going to have a workshop to discuss the Atlas site. I just want to introduce my team. I think most of the folks here might have, or some of the folks here might have been at the meeting last night. So some of the presentation tonight will be redundant. We're going to speed through certain portions of it to get to the market analysis, the economic part of it, because we think that will be important for the dialogue tonight. So the team, obviously myself from Welch Comer Engineers, Matt Anderson and Amy Hartman from Heartland, they're our real estate consultants, Mark Sindell and Don Behage there. They're from GGLO Design, our land planner, urban designer, and Del Hatch, the landscape architect for the public space. So our objective tonight is to present the council with really kind of two things. What is our project objective, which has really been laid down by the Ignite board and the council already. I'll hit that in a second. We want to talk about the community input process that we've done up to this date. This project is unique because it is intended to reflect the community values where we can do that, but it also needs to be balanced with the economics. So we think it's important for the city council and the board members to be able to articulate to their constituents. We asked, we listened, and we did the best that we could to reflect your community values. So hopefully what we show you tonight, in summary, you guys can look at it and say, okay, we get that, and we understand why the community wants that and why they'd like this, but maybe it doesn't fit. So those are kind of the two big objectives. I'm working through the introduction now. GGLO is going to talk about the land use, Dell's going to talk about the public space, and then the real estate part of it, which we've allocated a lot of time to, and then we'll do some closing at the end. Is that you, Jeff, or is it me? Okay. Thank you. The other thing I want to make sure that we offer up is, and I asked the mayor ahead of time if this was okay, and Chairman Hoskins, I think it is probably appropriate for your board as well, is that we want this to be a discussion. So as we're moving through, and you guys have a question, just shout it out and we'd like to get it addressed. So the project objective, create a private development, the land use and the public space, that will support preserving the waterfront. That was the number one objective we heard when we started into this. Balance the funding to try to reduce the gap, and you'll hear us talk about gap here quite a bit later, and then create a unique and desirable community addition that reflects our community values, something that's special that doesn't exist in Coeur d'Alene yet. The community engagement process, as you guys know, Councilmember Miller and Hillary have been leading this effort, and it has been fantastic. I do a lot of this stuff, as well as Dell and the rest of our team, and it's been a lot of fun. Kiki is a great boss to work for, and she really keeps us on track, and so I'm watching my time here carefully. The Atlas Waterfront Project process, you guys saw this last night. This just shows our community meetings that we've had. I'm not going to go through them in detail. It shows kind of our next steps. Once we get through here, we're going to prepare a development plan and just continue to move through this so we can meet the schedule that I've worked out with the Urban Renewal District. So these are going to be our quick takeaways. You saw these last night if you were there, but it's intended to show the community values that we listen to. And this isn't going to surprise you. You guys have seen a lot of this before. Pedestrian and bike access, retaining the waterfront, unique identity. The big thing that came through in all three meetings, which has been a surprise to me, is the willingness to accept higher density for more public space, which I just wouldn't have guessed that was the case, but we've heard that. So that came through. These are some of the images that we showed for types of network at our road network at our public meeting number 2 that we did, the types of housing product that might exist. Very surprising to me anyway. These are some of the project development or the public space development that we drew out. The big one for the council here is the general obligation bond. You can see there in red that the community seemed to be willing to accept a general obligation bond. And I know that's kind of an easy thing sometimes because it didn't have a monetary value to it. And if we came back and said, well, the general obligation bond is $50 million, the reaction might be different. If it's, $1 million, maybe they are still willing to accept it. This is some of the voting that we did last night, and I won't dwell on this because they're on the website. I didn't see Amy. Hopefully we sent them to her, so hopefully they're on there. Oh, excellent, thank you. That was another one that I was getting text messages today from Councilmember Miller, and we were reducing this data. And it gives us guidance, kind of a general flavor of what folks like and what they don't like. They do like bridges. They don't like a harbor house or a harbor master house. We think, again, this one might have had a negative reaction to it because it showed boats in a marina, but they really liked this waterfront dining one when we looked at the dots, and you can see where we say preferred option there. Public space, some more public space amenities. The beach was popular. There's some of these things that were, the dog park surprised me a little bit. I would have thought that one would have received a lot of positives, but it's kind of a wash.
Their owners?
Yeah.
Phil,
Yes,
just
sir.
a quick question. On the stickers they were using, did they only get one sticker, or could they have as many stickers as they wanted?
No, there was a finite number of stickers that they had. They had 3 stickers that they were able to distribute. The logic behind that was to make them prioritize to some extent. And try to get an economic component to it. You can't have everything. So pick what you like the most.
Okay. But they got 3 stickers at each station.
Yes, thank you, yes. This was another one that surprised me here on the Mount Hink site. Putting a softball or a baseball or a softball or a soccer complex in there. And remember, we always got to keep this in the back of our mind that the demographic that shows up to public meetings represents a certain group of people. You all represent everybody. So I think it's, and I know you guys do this, you keep in the back of the mind that this is a snapshot of a subset of maybe folks that aren't big sports fans and they don't want to see it there. One of the things you'll see, though, is the way we respond to that is we're actually going to show you an alternative to that we developed today in response to that, because we're trying to deliver to you product that responds to what the community told us. So then you can decide from your perspective what you think might be appropriate and give us guidance moving forward from here. Dell was furiously sketching on here, and Don from GGLO was doing other stuff, so you'll see some of their work here in a little bit. Just a couple other, this was another big one. The natural treatment of the shoreline, it doesn't receive a lot of favorable response. Structured where you can get down to the water, probably no surprise, receives a lot of favorable response. This is a little bit of a challenge to construct. This is much more challenging to construct from a regulatory perspective. It can be, I'll knock on wood a little bit, it can be done. It's just more challenging because it's done in lots. It's done in other communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Don to start working through their process. It will again be abbreviated from last night, but be sure to feel free to stop these guys and talk to them and ask questions. There's the clicker, and you should be good to go.
Okay, thanks, Phil. And before Don dives in, just 30 seconds on GGLO. Many of you heard this, but we've been doing projects like this for a little over 30 years, working on predominantly at the block, village, town, and city scale to really look at the same components we have here. How do we look at public access and open space and public amenities and development and infrastructure, roads, circulation, trails, as woven together to create place. All are great benefits, and you put them together thoughtfully with certain urban design principles, we create great place and communities. So that's what we're all about, and this is a good test of that.
Thank you, Mark. Once again, my name is Don Vagey, and we'll just jump right in. So, as we mentioned last night, it's very important to think about this and look at it in context, not just concentrate on the Atlas Mills site itself, although the site is very interesting. And when we do that, we start to understand the potential connections through to Mill River, the gap in between this site, potential connections here and here, understanding Atlas coming through the site, Prairie Trail, knowing that there's a whole system of trails already in place, both over here, along the freeway, Centennial Trail, along New Saltese, along here with the improvements coming down to the southeast, and thinking about how does this project really engage with Riverstone. That's also very key, because there's a lot of connections that are already set up. And if we think about how we even improve this area here, we can actually bring Riverstone Park kind of into the development as a whole. We thought that was a really important context to think about, and that's why you've seen this drawn into the plan, connecting all the way down to BB Boulevard. And then some of the principles that we think, well, we've talked about a lot about optionality and different things that can happen here.
You're going to have a challenge. You have to use the mouse, because you won't see it on TV for pointers.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I know how to do this. I've done this before.
Maybe he hasn't.
I want to make sure I can get it, so I can.
Old school.
Okay, let's see. There's the mouse. I'm going to try to. Is it okay if I stand like this?
No.
Having said all of that stuff about context, as we think about entering the site, people coming and going, a couple of key principles that we've been are kind of driving the concept, the overall site layout. One is, get the mouse to come up, is great street connections and views and access. We've heard this, we've tried to implement it throughout the plan. Great streets, complete streets, with, as I said, views at the street and unobstructed to the water. That's very important. If you're going to live here, or if you're going to come visit here for any period of time, you want to be here, a lot of it, because of the waterfront. We want to have this great waterfront park or waterfront open space and trail system. So let's make sure we're highlighting that through how we lay out the site. And so it's not just about these streets, but also happening with the intermediate streets here. And of course, the orange lines here, the more yellowy lines, are talking about showing how the trail connections work between this and the other amenities around the site. At the ends of each one of these streets, we imagine something unique happening, some kind of destination. There may be something happening. Oh, thank you. Yes. That's okay. Something happening here. That's right. I'm going to have to do both at the same time, right? This is just marking different destinations at the end of each street. Sometimes it'll be more open. Sometimes it might have a plaza. And sometimes it might be more passive. Sometimes it may be more active. Mark will show you some visual examples of what those could be. So moving on, what this zooms into the site and really highlights the streets and public open space system. So you start to see all of the pedestrian routes, sidewalks from the variety of different streets leading down. The lighter color is suggesting a bike trail. Del will talk about that in more detail. Separated, because we think they're going to have a lot of people here, separated from the walking path along the route. And you start to see some of those things happening along the water's edge. And also interesting opportunities for things to happen up at the edge of Mount Hink, or what we might be calling Atlas Hills or Atlas Butte. We're going to show you that in a minute. Something up here with connections traversing the downslope, whether it's a street, whether it's a public stair or hill climb, so as much connectivity between the upland and lowland areas. And what it starts to set up, if we think about the Prairie Trail, we think about you just coming up Suzanne, potential for loops within the site, loops. We have the loop at Riverstone, loops within larger Riverstone neighborhood, and beyond the site. It's something very interesting, a number of ways to move around the site and enjoy it. Within that framework, so think of this as the framework, the bones. There are some variations within this, which I'll show you in a minute, but how do we start to fill in that framework with development? And we think a pattern like this makes a lot of sense, optimizing a variety of different development types, not having all one necessarily. That's kind of a smart move, thinking about the marketplace over time. And so what we're proposing here is a series of potentially townhouses along, or townhomes along the Riverfront street. And this is a slow street. It's very carefully designed. Mark will again show some images of that later, but thinking very carefully about the cross-section from the building to the sidewalk, to the street itself, to the trails, views through on-street parking where it makes sense. One of the ways that we create a great curb appeal with that is by not having it, hopefully not having it interrupted with too many driveways. We do an alley along there. It allows us to potentially just bump the density a little bit to take advantage of the value that we get along that road, and sets up the potential for other development on the other side of the block. In this case, we're thinking about some potentially small lot single family as we move further up the hill. I'm going to show you one in a minute where the pattern might be a little bit different, highlighting those views to the river, maybe apartments here. Red is indicating retail or some kind of commercial, could potentially be office as well. Along Atlas coming in with a really great potentially restaurant and deck overlooking the water. Potentially another one here at this riverfront open space here at the end of, we've been calling this maybe Riverview Street or Riverview Road or Boulevard, to be determined. There are other ways to fill in this pattern, and we can talk about that in some of the optionality. So this, putting the two together, this allows you to see the pattern as a whole. I'm just going to jump in to, this is new for folks. It's all about these blocks here. I talked about those street end views to the river. What's kind of interesting, and having walked the site and seeing it again today, thinking that this might actually have a lot of value. So there's almost the same number of units. Thinking just from an apples to apples comparison, proposing townhouses along the edge. But if we were to create streets like this, 3 blocks that work with streets in a north-south direction, very gently tipping down towards the water. And when you come out of your home, go visit your friends, you always have a view down to the water. That's kind of an interesting thing. And if you go out in the site and imagine it, it's kind of powerful. Something to think about. There's a difference of about 6 units overall with that. If we do an apples to apples comparison, we could play with the widths and things and make it be equal. Now, here's interesting. Go from here. Now I'm going to jump quickly to what if one scenario, one idea for bringing the triangle in to connect at the upland level. I talked about those loops. So this starts to create potentially an upland street, sort of parallel to Saltese coming across. In this case, we're showing potentially apartment flats here, potentially a continuation of small lot single family. There are variations on this. I talked about the trail at the top of the hill. We're kind of calling it the rim trail. When you start to imagine this coming through and incorporating with this, the triangle site, the hilltop here, through those trees, connecting back to Saltese, it's kind of an interesting system, potentially with a pedestrian bridge here, which I think would be pretty cool. This shows about, as I had it in my notes here, about 33 units on this parcel, single family and townhouses all together. It's about 3.8 acres. And at this point, I think I'm going to move on and or let Mark jump in. Yeah.
Okay, so character-wise, what does some of this look like? Don talked about connectivity, which is really important to adjacent neighborhoods. The other thing about this, with a really robust and gracious open space and river frontage, we think it's important to create a little bit more of a compact development that's walkable so that it's connected within. And this might look and feel a little bit different than some of the other developments where once you get here, it's going to be really comfortable and easy to move by bike or foot. So that starts to inform the river drive that Don talked about and how to create a street along the river that is gracious, a complete street, Don used that term, where it's for pedestrians, cyclists, and cars alike. It's slow, it's scenic, and it starts to bring another aspect of public access to the river's edge. Then along that, talked a little bit about commercial and retail. There's spill-out spaces, views, places for people to hang out outside, whether it's dining or shopping, and again, there's this compact feel to how we lay that out. And then there's the open space and river frontage and connections along the river. We want to pull some of that up into the development as well. So those street ends that Don talked about that are perpendicular to the river have areas that Del can talk about a little bit that are punctuated with another level of gathering spaces that are a bridge between the upland development and the recreation along the river. And then a diversity of housing is really important, quality housing. Part of this is, as Don talked about the Triangle site, we're actually excited to see some diversity and higher density on the edges that may be proposed. That actually gives us a little bit more character and feel as placemaking for the neighborhood. And again, as Don said, walking the site again, it feels different in the different plateaus and areas, so there's lots of opportunity to build in a diversity of experience. So as we move to the central area, there's a slightly different character. This could be some of the character of the more single-family lots that Don talked about. There could be some integration of townhomes, as we talked about, with a little bit of retail. One of the comments from the community last night was the idea of a little bit of a nexus at the end of the main drive towards the Riverfront restaurant that Don mentioned. So there could be something to probe a little bit more there. And then really understanding the rim trail and how that can be integrated as an element for the housing that's in the more upland portion of the site to make that as attractive and as connected as the riverfront housing. So we think that the entire site could be pretty spectacular. Another idea of, again, weaving that together through a complete road and trail system, so it's all part of a larger idea. And then as we get to the primary open space, Dell's going to get more into this, but it's the idea of the housing is immersed in the open space experience, and it's about beautiful views over recreation and the river. And then, of course, a restaurant or pub as a major draw. That's part of the site. And then access to the river, as we mentioned earlier. And then amphitheaters and gathering areas. And then, again, finally connecting back towards the end and amenitizing that with perhaps a dog park and other potential uses, that this is really for the entire community, families, dogs, so forth. So with that, Dell's going to jump a little bit more into detail on the open space and recreation areas.
So this slide corresponds to one of the first slides that Don walked you through that showed the proportion of the open space, the public access to the water, et cetera. And we've illustrated a little bit more definition in it and start to show some options for what we feel might be appropriate. I will, let's see here. There we go. I'll move from the west to the east, and we'll blow these up a little bit so you can see them in a little bit more detail. This is the area that Phil was talking about with the softball and the soccer, and the upper portions or sort of the upland area of the property. This down to the southeast, connecting to the Riverstone area, and then all the way over to the border of the property here. Don talked about the framework of the project, and I think this is really critical and important to the road system and how it relates to the water and how it relates to the accessibility of the water, both visually and physically. So at the terminus of these roads, opening this up, leaving it open for the the views of the upper elevations, and then creating opportunities for people to get close to the water, get over the water, in some cases even get down to the water and touch it. So an overlook might be proposed down on this end. This was the commercial potential restaurant site or such. The orange on this slide represents the bike portion of the trail. The light blue represents the pedestrian side. So the pedestrian side is always the close one to the water. A little bit slower moving. Here you can see at each of these roads opening the views to the water. They might be different. That one slide that Mark just showed you of more hardscape elements or gathering spots at the water. We might develop those at one of the road terminuses. At another one, it might be a little bit more natural and integrated into the shoreline itself. We're looking at opportunities to even get down to the water in this little nook. There's actually a beach located in this location right now. We're suggesting maybe even the possibility of a fishing dock or something like that. Moving a little bit further to the east, this is the commercial site that's adjacent to the large public open space on the water. And we think that it might be important to consider the opportunity for transient docks at that location, just another vehicle for people to come to the entire development, or specifically to use the recreational trail system with all of the public open space, or maybe even this commercial site here. That's the site, the commercial site I just spoke of. The orange trail again is the bike, the blue is the walking trail. So you can see the road system is very curvilinear throughout the project. That was one of the things, one of the slides that Phil showed you that showed sort of the red sweeping road system was one of the things we heard in, I think, in our second meeting, and preference from people versus a straight city grid, have a little bit more of a movement to the streets, so we get some curvilinear action there. And the importance of something like that, if we're looking at a road along the river, that sight lines get broken and the view takes in more of a green space here, moves up around it, and then starts to curve into the heart of the property. So one of the larger ideas for this space would be to potentially recreate the historic mill pond area. That was part of the mill. So opening it up for river flow into this area, opening it up here for an outflow, and obviously bridge crossings at that point for the trails at this location and this location. Some of the things we heard in our second meeting, and one of the reasons they're incorporated into this plan, is from preferences on the voting dots, were open space along the water, gathering spots. This would be the potential for an amphitheater. In this case, we're looking at it as possibly even a floating removable dock as a stage. There was a great slide that Mark showed you just a minute ago. The gateway to the park might happen here again at a terminus of one of the main roads, this one connecting northward to Suzanne. The opportunity for a community gathering structure or pavilion, parking off of the Riverfront Road to access this area directly. And one of the more key elements that had gained favor in all of our meetings was the opportunity to develop a non-motorized accessible launch for canoes, kayaks, paddleboards, things like that. In this case, we have access parking here. There'd be an accessible route down to that launching dock there and launching and maneuvering into calm water. Another potential overlook at this point. Let's see. I'm very touchy, I apologize. And then down in this area, a swimming beach. This is the one area along the river where the topography may allow us to take the grades, maneuver them back to what may have been the original grades in this area, and create a swimming beach, obviously with protective buoyed areas, etc. And a little bit further east down in this area was the reference to a dog park. And what we've heard over the years with a number of projects we've been exploring here in town is that we have a lot of dog parks in the area, but people are looking for water access for their dogs. So this was the idea down here, that we'd have access to the water for the dog park. There's an existing dog park that sits right about here. It's being proposed that it might be recaptured for potential housing of some sort. So moving it back down here and giving access to the water. This was a plan we described last night. After the voting, as Phil said, we were surprised to see how many people put red dots on this and didn't feel as though it was necessarily an appropriate use of this space. Had 2 full-size soccer fields, with this one overlapping the outfield of a softball field. Parking, servicing it off of what were our working title of Riverview Drive or Boulevard, and then the potential for more parking over here on the east side. The reason we're looking at these types of uses for that particular area of the site is that there's some very restrictive soil issues in terms of being able to build on that property. This plan showed what would be a very much scaled down approach to the green space. If funding were short, or if this became, say, the very first phased approach with the ultimate goal of developing it into the one I just explored with you, this area through here may lack the water and become more of just a green open space. You still have a pavilion space, possibly smaller. Still have a playground. I didn't describe that earlier, but we had proposed a playground in this area. The accessible launch is gone under this scheme. No real close access to the water unless there may be an opportunity to sneak it down in this location right here. And then the reason it's not fully colored is I'm only coloring what changes were from the previous plan. So just some softening of these areas at the terminus of these roads. The dock would be removed along the waterfront here. Pavement, hardscape taken out, replaced with turf. And then some of the riprap, that cool kind of step seating that Don and Mark were showing you earlier. We had proposed that that might occur in some of these areas, down in here. Obviously, you don't see any docks in this version, and some of that step seating we thought might be interesting near the inlet to that water. So that's been removed. In the area up above where we had fields, it now becomes more limited parking and access, but mostly just more of an open playfield. Still quite a bit of material to move and grade and flatten, even in this scheme here. There's the bridge, excuse me, the bridge that Don was talking about that might possibly connect to the rim trail. So here's the scheme that we talked about and developed earlier this afternoon after we spent all morning on the site and walked all of it. And looking at that area, we said, well, what could be an alternative to fields? And the idea came up that could we manipulate the material that's already there, shape it gently, turn it into more of a natural area, recreate it in a fashion that would have more native grasses, wildflowers, some plantings in the draws that might be developed between the high points here, 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 and here, and create a network of trails throughout with orientation points where the public can access it from roads or sidewalks, the bridge and rim trail still being an opportunity, overlooks that might have interpretive opportunities, connection down to the waterfront portion, and then connections over here to the Prairie Trail as well, and eventually up to the trail system on Celtice. These are just some images that we were looking at to sort of convey what that area might look like. Wildflowers on it, native grasses, soft trail systems, this type of a character. Now, obviously, we don't have quite that much elevation, but there's substantial elevation in that area, probably 30, 40 feet. These were the ones that Phil just went through with you. I won't go through them again. Those are the ones that the folks voted on. You saw their preferences. There's that stepped shoreline treatment that I was mentioning. At this point, I'll turn it over to Matt and Amy.
Good evening. I'll redo the Heartland introduction for those of you who weren't at the meeting last night. Heartland's a real estate consulting and investment firm based in Seattle. We're as a firm, about 34 years old. I've been with the firm for almost 20 years. When we started, the firm was started as a land syndication and development company, so it built a very multidisciplinary approach to real estate, because that's what you need to do, large-scale land development. And then in the late 90s and to today, we do a lot more advisory work than we do investment, that we still maintain some of that. So we do a lot of work with a wide variety of client types, and public agencies is a big one, as well as real estate companies, which would include developers and investors. And then we have a pretty sizable corporate real estate function, which involves, portfolios of owner-user occupied real estate. So it really does kind of cover a very broad gamut. And for a project like this, it's very helpful to be able to draw on all of those different experiences, because you've got a little bit of all of that in the mix. So for a project like this, we're serving two roles principally. The first of them is a stand-in for the groups that's not the people who aren't here yet, and that's the development community, the builders, the investors, the lenders, those who are going to help implement the real estate side of that vision. So our job is to and it's the second role that we play is that of worrying about all of the risk, both future risk going to be taken by developers and the risks that are being taken by the public agencies kind of endeavoring to do the first part of this project. So we worry about everything like a good owner would. That includes the size of the project, the speed of absorption, the conservative or aggressive forecasting of pricing, the timing, interest rates, you name it. So that's kind of, we feel like that's kind of our job, is to kind of sweat that piece of it, both now in the near term, as we're talking about phase one, but also for the long term, so that you as a public agency nor future investors and developers get into a situation that is not economically sustainable. So the way we start that out with a project like this is we take the big components of the project's economics. And so we put this graphic together to kind of help illustrate that a little bit. So at the top, you've got your big costs for this project, and that's, in this case, the land acquisition, the park costs, backbone infrastructure, the trails, all of the things that we just kind of walked through, all of those cost components. We bring kind of all of those in. And then we're comparing that, through a cash flow analysis to the revenue that this is going to generate out of the land sales over time. So we've looked at the individual blocks, as you saw Don and Mark walking through, and we're in the process of kind of pricing each one of those based on the product that would ultimately go there. And we're doing that, and it's kind of diagrammed below, and Amy's going to talk about it in more detail. We do that through a residual land value analysis by block. So we're literally putting a future acquisition number to the development opportunity associated with a single block at a time in the future. And ultimately, it's pretty straightforward. We're comparing those costs, and then we're worrying about the timing of all of that. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the discussion.
Okay. So I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit of our methodology as to how we value the different parcels or development blocks that are available on the site. As Matt said, we used a residual land value analysis, which basically, so you can see on this chart that it shows sort of the way a developer would look at it. So they will look at a site and say, what am I going to build on this? Whether it's townhomes or single family dwellings or retail, whatever it is. They'll look at how much it would cost to build that. They will look at how much they have to pay their equity, how much they have to pay the bank, how much they have to pay for capital, which are represented on this chart here. And then they're compare that to what they could sell the site for, what they could sell the developed product for. And the difference between the value of what they developed and what it costs to build it essentially is what they can afford to pay for the land. So you can use that to derive a value of what you could expect someone to pay for these sites. So we went through for every different use. We primarily decided to focus on residential for this site. There's a lot of retail in the vicinity of this area, and office, depending on if you could find a user in advance. If you couldn't, it doesn't really pencil. So we went through, I'm going to go through the residual land value analysis for the different types of residential. So we looked at single family first. We are assuming about 300,000 square feet of the total site area is dedicated to single family use, which is about 60 units. That's a density of 9 units per acre, roughly. It costs about $160 per square foot to develop, and that's just hard costs without contingency or soft costs added in, which are an additional 15% of that. We are assuming that you can sell these developed homes for about $300 a square foot. And so when you put that into our residual land value calculator, that would make the value per unit about $125,000.
We should say at this point that we feel like we've been fairly conservative. Sorry.
Yes. At this point, we feel like we've been fairly conservative, and these are all in 2018 numbers as well. So when we're talking about phasing and selling things in 4 years or 5 years, we've also applied a factor for escalation of land values. But just to simplify it, we're talking about in today's values for now. Okay, for townhomes, we have about 270,000 square feet of the site developed to that use, which is around 120 units. That's a density of about 20 units an acre. We have $160 dollars per square foot, similar cost to single family. And they sell for less, about $270 a square foot, but because you can build more on the same amount of land, the value is higher. It's about $24 per land square foot versus $20 for single family, or about $60,000 a unit. For condos, we've dedicated about 150,000 square feet of the site. And I should clarify, for condos, we're talking about a stacked flat type typology, but for sale product. So when I'm distinguishing between condos and apartments here, I'm talking about for sale versus for rent. So these cost about $210 a square foot to build, and they sell for $370 a square foot. So that would be a value per unit of $18,000, or a land square foot price of $16. And finally, apartments. We also have about 120,000 square feet dedicated to that as well. We're getting about 100 units. Which is about 33 units an acre. They cost a similar amount of money to build as condos, but because of the parking, they don't return as much per square foot. So the land value in this case would be a little bit lower. It would be $18,000 a unit, but you would get fewer units on the same acreage. So then the question is, why don't you just develop all of what has the highest residual land value, which is townhomes? And the reason that we don't do it is because of absorption. So if you just took about 22 acres of land and built a ton of townhomes on it, it would take you a really, really long time to sell them, because they're all geared towards kind of the same market. They're very similar, the product, to each other, and you can only sell so many of a certain type of residential use in a certain quarter, a given year, on the same site in the same area. So this is just to illustrate that. On the bottom, you have how long we think it would take to absorb single-family housing if all the units were developed as single-family, whereas on the top you have a variety of uses like we have on the site, and you can see that you can sell the different uses or lease them in the case of apartments at the same time, which means that you can, I guess the developer would get their investment back faster, which means you can sell land faster and recoup your investment in the site faster. And then this is close approximation of what we're thinking in terms of how the site will be laid out by use and how it will be phased. So this is obviously still in flux, but we're thinking about 4 phases, which will provide about 400 units total, 400 homes on the site, broken out between apartments, condos, townhomes, and single family, as you can see on this chart.
This is probably a good spot to break, and we can take questions certainly on that and have a discussion about it. I think that it's an important. We're at an important point in this process, this financial analysis. We're effectively underwriting this this project kind of real time, as the land plan has been changing, as you saw, almost every day for a while now. So what we don't have right now is a financing plan. We have a great dynamic cash flow that's so dynamic it changes a lot, but we're not here to say here's how you're going to pay for all of this and make it all balance out. What we do know is that the real estate, the development portion at these residual land values in these blocks with an approximation of the infrastructure and an allocable share of the land acquisition, that part pencils. There's a margin there, so the development portions, if you break it all out, that works financially. What it doesn't do is pay for all of the park. On it, there's not a surplus that's so big that you get a park for free out of the development piece. That's not in the cards for sure. The other thing that we would identify as kind of key findings at this point is we most certainly have a challenge, like every master plan developer, with timing. So phase ones of a project like this are the most difficult part of the project. So you've got this kind of big slug of upfront investment that you have to make into that phase one infrastructure, and you've got to get things rolling, and you've got to recoup the funds. So a big part of the analysis over the next several weeks is going to be working with Tony and working with the city and city staff on where we're going to bring those dollars together in that upfront, and then how are we going to pay those back. A big portion of that discussion, really that we kicked off in earnest today with a lot more detail, is about how the River District urban renewal area can be brought to bear on maybe phase one, focusing on that piece of it, how a new urban renewal district, temporarily calling the Atlas District, might apply to the rest of the phases, so the rest of the phases of the project, so kind of using those two in their different chunks, and really figuring out in a very detailed way, how are we servicing that debt over the terms, the 2 different terms of those 2 different renewal districts. And that's the task going forward, and making sure that and if we're not able to kind of see how we balance in any particular phase, is the question has to be asked again in an iterative process with the rest of the design team, is can we break it up differently? Can we skinny up that first phase? Can we move this piece over there so that we're not carrying such a big load at any one time? So it is really a cash management kind of challenge, and also identifying kind of the sources of funds. I will say that I guess gut instinct says that we're going to need additional funds beyond what we've talked about for the urban renewal districts. And that's been kind of part of the discussion all along, but we're not ready to say how much that is necessarily. But we do feel like there's enough of a gap, especially in timing, that there's going to need to be some additional investment up front to get the project started. Once it does start and we move out of phase 2 and you're into phase, or out of phase 1 and into the other phases, those phases kind of, cash flow, if they're right sized, you're putting out just enough infrastructure to do the next phase, you're selling off pads, builders start building, and then you move on to the next one. That's when the cash flow stays positive for a number of years until you're done. It's just that upfront piece that we're still trying to figure out how do we kind of weave this all together to kind of have it make sense without taking too much risk on any side. So we said a lot right there, but maybe we could take a moment for questions.
I have this, you guys talk in a different world, so I just have to kind of simplify. So you showed us how many apartments, how many townhouses, and then you gave us dollar values. What were those values? Was that the development value or the profit value?
So in this case, you're playing. I don't mean you, but you're creating the development opportunity. So right now you've got raw land, right, and you need to get to what we would call finished pads. That's the opportunity for the builder, the builder, whether it's a home builder or an apartment builder or condos or retail, that person to come to the table and build their project, the vertical project. And so what we're identifying, those numbers that you saw there, that's the value of the finished pad, and that's what you're essentially creating product, if you want to think about it that way. Your product is a development, a single block development opportunity for a specific use. So that residual land value number, like $26 a foot per square foot, that's the number that we're applying to the say the townhouse or the single family portion of the site.
That's not the value of the finished product, what it'll sell for.
Well, we backed into that number by approximating that future number, but that's not really it's only relevant to you as it affects the land value, because you're not selling a finished product, you're selling land. But we did back into that because you want to make sure that you're, like I said, we have to worry about the details. We're worried about the future builders and making sure that there's a margin that would make them want to do this project and also pay you for the land. So that's kind of that's why we back into the residual land value that way. But what you're selling, and from a cash flow standpoint, you're really balancing the sale of finished pads against the extension of infrastructure. That's your business, effectively.
So that doesn't include the infrastructure, street, sewer, water, all that, no.
No.
Yeah, right, that's a cost, and the residual land value is a revenue, right? So we're balancing those two out. And that's the challenge of the cash flow. We're trying to, how much do we put out and when do we get it back in?
Okay, thanks.
Mayor?
The 1, 2, 3, 4, the significance of those, and maybe I missed something on a previous slide. Are those proposed phases or?
Yes.
Okay. Are you going to get to that or?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So we're really, it's very fluid. We've been really working through a lot of stuff, and at the moment, what we're focused on is a phase 1 that comes in, and I think Dell identified it. Our working title for that road, that major road, is Riverview or something like that. But so that's a major road that, and then we've put the development that surrounds that road into the phase, right? Into that phase. Because if you're gonna pay for that road, you want to get as much out of it as you can. And we have two things going on here. You need that road for the park, right, to access the site along the river, and then you want to build around it, right? So we're kind of sizing that first phase to accommodate those things. And it's a pretty big. The first phase is the biggest of the phases in the project. So then phase 2, 3, and 4 are really moving towards the west. And the reason for that is we're worried about the cost of extension of infrastructure. So we want to do it in increments where we're timing it as closely as possible to the sale of development pads. So we're kind of working our way to the west across the site.
So you're saying the Riverview is basically the one that runs down to the road that runs down from the river from Celtice Way?
Yes.
What are we calling the one then that extends along the green belt? Do we have a name for that yet?
Phil Way? No.
Whitmire Way.
Whitmire.
So does part 1 include that road right now? Everything is in flux, but does it include that road along the green space, phase 1?
This is,
I'll play Vanaway.
yeah, so in the phasing, it's an interesting process when we do phasing, because I'm approaching it from an infrastructure standpoint and what I've got to do to make Terry Pickle happy and Chris Bosley happy, because we have to have, and Kenny Gabriel, to achieve road circulation and utilities. The market folks are approaching it for a different way, and Dell and Don and Mark are approaching it from a different. So when Matt was saying it is iterative, that's the process, and we kind of argue over what's the way to achieve it. And so that's the base. And as as Matt was saying, Riverview comes down this way. The orangey color comes down to where the marina is here, and it includes the park down to this point, down to the dog park and the Douglas. It doesn't include anything on the existing Centennial Trail that's in this blue color, but it comes up and captures this. And so the way that we work through the process is they say, how much does that cost? And we sit there and work on our engineering estimates, and we tell them, and they say, well, this is the residual land value that comes out of it. We're out of whack. Can we take this out of here? Can we add this back in? So I hope that answers the question, Mayor, but it includes the portion of this Riverfront drive from the green area here to the blue area here, and it includes the Suzanne connection, because we need to be able to provide the fire folks a loop, and just for traffic circulation. This would be a temporary dead end, which I know Chris is sitting here grimacing, and we'd have to figure out how to deal with that, and this would be a temporary dead end on the riverfront.
So what would be the public improvements in phase one?
It's from this point right here at the dead end on the street down to the Douglas property on the southeast end. And everything in between there. And that's the challenge when we're working on the cost model. And one of the things we were doing today is we started backing out park costs. And okay, well, maybe the minimum thing we do is we go in there and it's graded, and we put a couple of the bike paths and the trail in there, and we put an irrigation system in, and we hydroseed it and plant it and let it grow. And then as phase two comes along, and two things, as phase two comes along, it starts to generate revenue, and as increment starts to come off of this, maybe there's additional revenue stream that we can come back in and do certain things. One of the things we probably wouldn't do is go put the water in, because the grading is all finished and it would be so disruptive. The other part that might be in it as well, and some of it depends on what happens up here, is this part, because if this place gets constructed and now we go in and build the soccer field later, well, that's irritating. You're living in your condo and there's a construction project going on for 3 months. And it also affects, which a bunch of the stuff I've learned, because they're yelling at me, no, you can't do that. And it affects the value of it, what the developer is going to pay. Because he's like, well, are you really building soccer fields, or are you just saying you're building soccer fields? Because if you are, I'm willing to buy it for one number. If you're really not, then I'm going to buy it for a lower number, because I don't know what you're doing there. And it's going to affect my long-term value of my product.
So there needs to be some simultaneous development of public and private. Because if you're going to come in, if you want to buy something in that private area of number one, you're going to want to see some public improvement. Because you're not going to buy in there saying, okay, we promise we're going to build something down the road. Right? You're going to want something that's built, and the public's going to want to see some progress on the public space as well.
That was the challenge today is working through these, and and I think for some of the folks that really dug into what our scope of work was, Tony and Troy, and how we were going to go through this process, this is a fairly compressed process, because we're in a 3-day period assimilating community input, sitting in our conference room and grinding numbers out, and then coming here and presenting it to the council and the board, with the hope that you guys will look at this and say, okay, we get it, and we understand the finances aren't generally worked out, but we are either like the direction you're headed or don't really like the direction you're headed. And if you like the direction we're headed, we'll continue to refine it and start coming back with more concrete numbers. I won't say very concrete. But so if it seems a little bit vague, it's because it's early in the process, in the kind of the number analysis.
Your scope initially then is to say, hey, are we in the ballpark, or are we just nuts here, right? So what you're saying is that we're kind of in the ballpark right now, but we need to fine tune those numbers.
Yes, and we could have come back and said, the difference to this. So yes, we're in the ballpark. We could have come back and said, yeah, the development that y'all were thinking about over here, that also loses money. So now you've got a big park that's very expensive, beautiful but expensive. So that's a negative number. Plus, you have this stuff that doesn't work. So you're not getting anything out of that, right? You have to carry all of that as well. So, but that's not the case. So that's the good news side of it. This part, with the development, if the costs are apportioned properly, yeah, that carries its own weight and it makes for a nice community. It also creates nice tax increment over time, which is hugely important to the financing of everything else. So yes to that. And to the other point that you made, which is exactly right, is we're doing our very best in this first phase in particular, because we're thinking about those transactions. So you're focused on teeing this project up and these building pads and then bringing builders in. So you're playing master developer to a degree. You're doing public realm stuff, but you still need to be on the marketing side, and you want the best developers to bring their A game to these individual parcels. So yeah, they're all going to ask the right due diligence questions. You've got funding for the park, right? You're building the park. I see you're building infrastructure, but also the park, you're going to build that. And that's what every developer will prudently press you on as you're trying to recruit them into the project to take a chunk of it off your hands. So it's going to be, as we flesh this out, there'll be a whole series of recommendations related to the timing and your approach to those, the transactions on an individual block level as well.
Or Mick, I guess we're...
So, quick question on phase one. How many units are in phase one, and what is the product mix?
Total units? Amy will answer the total units. So the product mix right now is single family.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, there you go. That's it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And the stuff that we're playing with is, we're trying to balance. We don't want to have too much of any one thing, and we're trying to recognize that that phase one is different than the other phases. It's a different piece of land, and so we were out there today thinking about, this is a really great piece of it. It's next to our really, really outstanding public park. It's got a really proximate, it's like a little bowl right around the river. So it's got these great views. So the pricing, we just showed you kind of the average pricing of everything kind of across the site. But as we're refining that, we're thinking, well, this block is better than the other block. So this is a better number or a worse number. So we're really thinking about those details. And then if we decide at the end of the day, however that space around the, what now says public open space, but maybe that becomes a different kind of park. Okay, well that's different than what we had originally thought, and the condo units adjacent to that are kind of on both sides of the building. One's looking out at the river with some nice views. The other one's looking at this very cool open space. So how does that affect pricing? So we're thinking about that relative to, is it maybe that same building typology wants to be apartments in other parts of the site, but here we want to do it as condos because we think it's going to make more money.
There is no commercial space in that calculation at this point in time.
There is, sorry, did I do that?
Yeah, I did that. Here.
Oh my gosh, you're messing with me. There is, and we have the map up, it's right, yeah.
But it's not calculated in at this point in time, is that correct?
No, it is.
On the previous slide it is, yeah.
It's just not shown on here because it's such a small.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a, right,
It's just a
right.
waterfront, small. It's a neighborhood restaurant that overlooks the water. It's not a huge part of the project, so
Okay, thank you.
that's why it's not shown here.
So that's actually a good question. So one of the things that was kind of an eye opener last night, somebody had made the comment, wouldn't it be great if you've got a lot of activity, you've got a lot of visitors and so forth to the park, and they're down at the waterfront, and you might have this transient moorage. Wouldn't it be great if there was some additional retail kind of stretching up Riverview, this north-south street? That way. Right now we're showing it as residential right there, but today standing on the site we were really rethinking that. So I could see a scenario where we're stretching some storefront along, on both sides of the street for maybe a block or so, to kind of give it more of a public realm kind of retail function. And then if we did that, then maybe this area we're showing that in commercial over in phase 4, maybe that's something that before it actually goes into development, there's some time and effort put to recruiting some companies. Maybe that turns to office. As we're showing it as kind of retail, neighborhood retail, but if it converted to, maybe it's medical office, which is a thing that's in demand. So maybe that switches up and it's more of an employment function than not, and we've already pushed some retail to the other part of the site. So like I say, it's a little bit in flux.
Over here to Dan English, and then we'll come back to you, Dan.
I wanted to touch base just briefly on the docks, and I know I think ultimately, having been a boater on the lake, and I think that there will be real value in having some day-use temporary docks, and I know in the first session, it showed like a marina. People do not want a marina. The other thing, it sounds silly maybe, but if you can call it any other thing than transient docks, because having been around people in life long enough, I can guarantee you some people are going to ask us, why are we building docks for transients? And the just day use, temporary for the restaurant and the parks, but just something so that they don't, in that first second in their brain, they make an emotion that they don't even think through necessarily. So I want to see the dock stay in, and for that matter, the water dog part too. But anyway, on the docks, use a different term if you can. So.
Fair point.
Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What was the methodology you used to arrive at your pricing?
So there was the residual land value approach that we just walked through.
Which land value? Land value of what?
So we created backed into a residual land value for each product type. So single family is different than condominium, which is different.
But what did you base those prices on? I mean, where did you base it on? Average prices in the city?
We back into residual land value, takes in the total development value. It subtracts out everything except land to solve for land. So we backed into that number, and then we take that number and we compare it to comparable sales, which is like an appraisal approach. And we look at those where we can find comparable sales, then we compare them back to that.
In the city?
Yeah, in the submarket, right? They're not comparable if they're not here. So
okay.
The trick in this case is you have a really unique spot. So when that's why we go to the brain damage of doing the residual land value to back into it to kind of prove it, because you don't have a lot of comps that are exactly the same, right? It's so looking at that alone wouldn't feel like a sufficient valuation exercise. So we looked at it from two ways: residual land value to get down to a number, and then check that number with other data, and then say, okay, that feels about right.
And you said you lowballed it.
Nope, I didn't say that. I said that we were conservative. The reason we're conservative...
What's the difference?
The difference is huge to me. Lowballing it would suggest that we actually think it's going to be a lot higher. When we're underwriting on behalf of public agencies or a private entity, we're conservative because if you're overly aggressive, and that's the challenge that developers get into, you run a much higher risk of missing those forecasts. And missing the forecast in this case could be a huge problem. So we're looking at it conservatively so that our financing isn't stretched too thin that the project fails in phase one.
How did you arrive on the ratio between commercial and residential?
So in this case, we looked at the market area. We looked at what's around it. So we're wary of over retailing. Previous generations of projects like this did a lot of that, and Riverstone has a fair amount and struggled to get at least. It's really close to this site. So for us, too much retail was a real concern. So we kind of peeled back from doing some of that. We only have about 30,000 square feet of retail shown on the plan as it is right now. And we think the majority of that is going to end up as food and beverage, because that's what, especially now in the retailing, that's really what people are looking for. So combinations of those things.
And then the ratio between single family, multifamily, townhomes, was that arrived by the same methods?
Yeah, and we looked at the site and how the site lays out, and what part of the property wants to be in a certain use, and also how those residual land values look. So, if you have too much of one thing that's kind of struggling on residual land value at the moment, then maybe you want to program other spaces for something else. The key is that we don't want to end up, and that's where Amy walked through the absorption, we don't want to end up with too much of any one thing in any one phase. So we want it to be able to be bite-sized pieces as much as possible, for fear that you're sitting on too much land for too long, because that kills the pro forma.
Thank you.
Sure.
Wood?
So I have a historical question for Tony and Troy. So using what these guys came up with mostly housing, and I'm looking now at Riverstone. If we go back to Riverstone, we put in the streets, we did this, there was all these plans. And the plans had to keep changing because the world changed, the economics changed. I guess I look to you guys saying, It seems Riverstone survived and has done a lot of different things to generate, for us to get our money back. With so much not commercial, I'm thinking commercial generates more taxes than homes and places to live. Do you guys see any relationship between Riverstone's kind of commercial side and this being more residential? Is that a question? Sorry.
So I think as our consultant team has shared with you, they've taken all that into account. And as you rightly say, Woody, that Riverstone started out with a whole different vision. I mean, it was a lot less residential, well, a lot less of what residential has been developed out there. More condo towers, more arenas and shopping centers. And as time moved on, the market changed and those uses changed. So what we have here is a target for what produces, and correct me if I misspeak here, but what produces the most land value for sales in order to help finance what we're trying to do out there. Now, we're not talking jobs at this time. We're talking about trying to get the product that will generate the most revenue to help satisfy the debt. Fair enough?
Yeah, and really, what does the market want here? So we're actually looking at the Riverstone and this and the surrounding area kind of all together. And the fact that Riverstone did have a lot more commercial, both office, professional office, and retail and food and beverage, kind of says, okay, well there's a fair amount of that there already. This project with all these rooftops is going to help that quite a lot. At the end of the day, it's more people within nice walking distance suddenly, so it'd be really helpful. But we wouldn't want to try and replicate that because that would be competitive, and the world has shifted. As an economic sector, retail is struggling, so we would be remiss to program this site up with something similar to what they struggled with in the past. So,
Thanks.
Other questions? Bill, did you want to are there more slides to go through here?
There is, I think, one of the things we wanted to hit a little bit, because this question came up about I'm going to zoom back to, I know I'm going way back. It was a long time ago. This triangle piece. And this was a little bit of a curveball because we've been looking at the site like this, and then the triangle piece is started to come into play a little bit. And so I have been asking our team, what do you think about that? What does that mean to us as both the community? And I guess I'll pause there for a second. It's a little bit unique working on this because we're not approaching this site just as a developer would, because a lot of times a developer doesn't have the broad constituency and vision that you all do. So we're trying to also create a community, balance the economics, and make a really great place. So we've been working with this space, and then all of a sudden the triangle piece is in play. So I'm asking the team, GGLO and Dell, what does this mean from a kind of a community perspective? Does it have great value to it? And of course I show it to Don, and Don gets terribly excited and starts sending this one night like at 2 a.m. or something. Last week he sends a sketch and says, I think this is great. It would really change the character of this space. And then when we look at it from an economic standpoint, and Heartland's looking at it, they kind of feel the same way. What we understand the current trade-off is, and we don't know all the things that have gone on, but if the trade-off is not significant, what the city has to do to acquire this, and I don't know, like I said, I don't know what that is, this is pretty valuable, and it would create kind of a complete the place, and you can see the impact of it. It might not be this exact configuration, but I don't know if we had addressed that thought enough, Mayor, and I know Don had hit it, and we were kind of quickly moving through this. And guys, if I've missed anything, we should probably go back and capture that. So that's one thought I wanted to share with. And then the other thought is to just address that again. We're showing an active use area there. That product that you see up there, and I call it a product because I think of Bill Greenwood providing products. I actually, we got with Bill and said, what are you missing in your lineup? And of course, he said, well, they stole they took the ball fields out of McEwen, so since those are gone, I need to replace those.
Bill said that.
Yeah. So he was missing a ball field, and he's missing a couple of soccer fields that he could use. But it's also a challenge to make that site, because now we've got to remove Mount Hink. And again, the way that it came up is I'm estimating what it's going to take to remove Mount Hink, and Amy and Matt are saying it's too much money. It's too much money. You can't have that much money in expense in phase one. Well, then we're thinking, well, what if we just leave Mount Hink and we shape it into this cool public space? Well, now the upfront costs go down, and we have opportunity to create a cool public space at lower cost. Part of the reason I'm kind of walking you guys all through this is you see the iterative nature of how this goes, and you can't accomplish this in 3 or 4 days. It's going to take 3 or 4 weeks to draw a bead on it and end up with an implementation plan that Tony can look at and say, okay, I get it. I see how you guys adjusted phase one to make a lower upfront infrastructure cost and a higher yield on selling these diversity of product, but we're still completing the park. Maybe it's not as fancy as we liked it to, but Dell was able to figure out how to program some stuff into phase 3 and phase 4. And you end up with this financial plan that is implementable. So when Tony and his board get together and start doing the urban renewal thing, they can say, gosh, we can feel good about doing this. But we can't head down that path until we get a little bit of direction that in concept, does this feel right to the council and the board, or do we need to head somewhere different? And I think if we were heading somewhere different, it probably has to be in the public space. Does it get smaller? Do you go back and address the waterfront issue where you are forced into a situation where you have to develop some waterfront residential, and that's going backwards? That was the number one community value. But if you're upside down in the early phases, are you faced with that? Do you do something up in this public space that we just leave it natural? So those are, I guess, some thoughts, Mayor, I just wanted to share and express to the council and the board that it is a more detailed iterative process that needs to go on, but we've got to kind of get your approval at the big vision that we're headed in the right direction, and then we'll get into the details. Oh, boy, the question, yeah, hands are, there was a bunch of hands that went up, Mayor.
Oh, I was snoozing here.
Yeah.
Amy, I'm sorry.
So Phil, you mentioned that the triangle parcel is valuable, and it looks like there's some townhomes and single family maybe that's been put in that piece.
Yes.
How many, can you give specifics, and why is it so valuable? Like, can you give more specific on the impact it makes and
The monetary or the community?
just what you said the word valuable, so can you just expand on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to channel a little bit, and then Don's probably the better person to come up. I think this initial one here, the number of townhomes that are up here will change, but it's valuable from a sales standpoint, actual revenue stream that would come in, because the amount of infrastructure that has to go in to create that is relatively small to the amount of money that it generates. And that's the battle we're always working through. If we can generate saleable property with a very small investment in infrastructure, that gives us a good net. The other one, the community value one, that's Don's better to speak to that.
Yeah, that's why I meandered up here. So if you can, I wish I could magically make a couple of different options appear within this. But remember how I talked about framework before, about the connective tissue, the connective pieces, the streets, the trails, and things like that? What's really nice and important about this, so in your mind, we do this all the time, so it's easy for me to say, but I'm going to put this challenge out to you a little bit here. I talked about the rim trail and this connectivity along here. That can happen as well as a street connection, which helps make the site more whole. You can avoid Celtice if you want to move around in certain ways, and it provides amenities. You can still do these things in different ways with different kinds of building types, different densities, more housing units. We actually had one here where we looked at it with apartments and I got the unit count up. Matt and Amy said, not sure if apartments are really going to work that well, at least 2 or 3 story ones in this case. And so we work through and different options for this. It could be more townhouses, could be other uses or some version of the larger building type here. You want to add something to that?
Yeah, so the triangle, which, like Phil said, has been an out parcel. We've been working around it, but not really coming up with a plan for it. It has 2 things from a valuation standpoint that are really striking. It does have Celtice frontage, which is a nuisance to residential, but is actually a positive to a commercial use. And then on the other side of it has a very prominent view from the edge, and we're referring to that as that kind of rim trail, and that has a lot of value to the residential side. So we're kind of looking at these 2 different components of that single triangle. So we're just kind of scratching the surface as to how do we capture the value on both sides of the site. So we were talking earlier today about could we do a 2-story medical office building that's accessed off of Celtice, and then on the south side of that site around that rim, can we get a row of townhouses, and then working in between so as to make the parking for the office building not feel awkward next to the entrance to the residential. We don't have an answer to it, but we're kind of trying to sort that out and find we're always looking for what is the optimum for any one part of the property, and then ultimately aggregating that to say what's the optimum for the overall community, the total numbers, and see how they kind of set together. I'd like to find a place to, I'd like to explore further that question of the office, specifically medical office, because it feels like it has an opportunity. So it needs some more research.
Folks had asked on the triangle while we're on it, does it add, I get the impression it's adding quite a bit of value because you can phase it in one. Is that correct? Phil, is that the way I got it from you?
I think the thought was that since we're working right around there and we're punching infrastructure right next to it, that the additional increment of cost to make that a developable piece is not so great, and therefore it's an opportunity. I wouldn't say that you wouldn't want to pay cash money for it at the residual land value just to turn around and sell it for the same number. That wouldn't be what we try to do. And I think the discussions that we had heard so far is that the trade-off actually has a benefit on the waterfront side off of this site entirely. And so you're balancing those 2 things out. Does it contribute to the site? Can it be done economically? And is there an outsized benefit elsewhere? And if so, then that would be worth doing.
Were you asking, was it about phase 1 particularly?
Yeah. Is that how you pictured?
Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we pictured it necessarily as part of phase 1, but I just want to go. This particular drawing builds off of this idea, and I'm going to one to that. It's more. They're more similar, and so it could, as I'll speak for myself, and you can, and just as I was laying this out, I was not thinking it would be in phase 1, but building in the optionality that it could come in phase 2, it could come in phase 3, it could come in phase 4. We're thinking about that all the time, and that because things change, and something may come up, some opportunity we can't even foresee right now. Now we got to jump on it. But if we at least think about how it can happen from the beginning. I'm specifically talking about the street connection and the potential for this trail connection on both ends. Especially this street connection, though, we can kind of quickly work that in.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I had a comment, been involved with the mayor and others talking to the owner of the triangle piece. And I guess I would suggest that he is an apartment developer. That's his deal. He likes to do it. He owns the property to the west of this property. And so I guess I would suggest that as designing goes forward, it's probably not productive to the negotiations with him for us to be designing apartments, particularly in that triangle piece. So I would tend to minimize the, certainly in an initial phase, apartments. And also the other thing, one of the reasons we've been looking at it so closely is it would allow us to extend a riverfront trail across what we call the Waugh Trust property, or the now owned by Lance Douglas, across there. So we would trade our railroad property through the middle of that for the triangle piece and then the right to have a waterfront trail. So, but I think that's significant. We're very early in discussions about an exchange, but his game is totally apartments. And if we're competing, he's actually expressed that maybe we are trying to drag our feet on his project, slow him down, because we're going to come in and build our own competing product. So just a comment to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think that's a good one. And I don't know, Matt and Amy, when we think about the products on the site, initially in the early phases, if we're in phase one, I don't think we had any apartment product in phase one.
Yeah, we didn't have that much rental in the first phase. So I guess you could also flip. I agree with everything you said. You might also think about it as he's an apartment builder in the area. He may be a very good buyer for other portions of this site as he's working through his property. So, it's not so much a competition because remember, you're not building apartments. You're creating land. Someone else is building the apartments. Maybe he's your guy. And so that's the way to think about the process. The market can only take what the market can take. So he's not, and other builders are not going to, endeavor to flood it. They're going to do it in a paced fashion because they have to as competitors to avoid going bankrupt. So, I mean, you might just think of them as a takeout for a portion of the site.
Right. I would just reiterate, his deal is building apartments. He's looking at maybe 700 to 800 units on that in a phased manner. And so I think anything that, discourage or suggests that whether it's us or whoever comes in and buys property is going to compete with that is counterproductive probably to our negotiations for the triangle piece.
Amy?
So with the addition of the 419 units, and then what happens on the property that we were just discussing next door, potentially a lot of apartments going in there, have we had any discussions on if it would be feasible for a school to be in this area? I know there's a real need in the community for a school, and we're adding a lot of homes, so I'm just curious what the discussion has been there.
I think we've had a little bit of a discussion about it, and I guess if the school district were bringing a wad of cash with them, that might provide the economic part of it. From I guess a community standpoint, is it a school and appropriate there? Maybe Don or you guys could, Matt or Amy could answer that. But I think it starts to plug in, and there was discussion earlier here about how projects evolve over time. You start kind of in one area, but there's a next flexibility and there's phasing that's built into it. You can envision that. I don't know that site is quite big enough for a school. This site would be very difficult to remediate, expensive to remediate, but maybe they're prepared to pay for it. When you get on this end of it, this is relatively flat in here, but I think what schools pay for raw dirt doesn't reach what single-family residence would pay. So now you're further in the hole, and you can't make the project pencil. You've heard us use that. I don't know if you guys have any other observations about that.
Other questions? Let's see, Kiki, you go ahead.
I just have a question about how the timing works for approving. If say today we assume you're on the right track, you've talked about some nuances that you're already aware you're going to tweak. Some of the questions you've presented to us. We approve you moving forward with coming to a conclusion with the feasibility study. How does the timing of annexing this piece and applying zoning to it occur? And the reason I bring that up is that I think that in all of the public meetings that I've gone to, the public is concerned that they'll see a plan, but there's not a solid enough set of rules applied to it so that what they saw will be changed once the parcel is sold to a developer. So can you explain that, how that piece works?
So there's a whole bunch of thoughts in there, and Hillary might have to help weigh in on it. If the vision for the council is ultimately, and the URA is ultimately, we like this design, we like the idea of a diversity of product type in here, and what you get to build here is townhomes. You start to become the master developer, and you start controlling what happens there through, this is what you get to build there, and with design standards. And these are things that Don and Mark put together all the time, where literally when someone comes in, they're restricted to this type of product in this area, and it's got to generally look like this. There's RFP processes that the URA can use to do those things. I think that would probably be, as if you are the master developer, and in this situation, in order to generate enough revenue, you kind of have to be. You can't go sell the whole thing just raw and have someone else come in and build it, because the discount rate becomes too high for them, and the value goes down, and you can't pay for the park. And that's the thing that we have to keep in the back of our mind here, is that we're doing this, but we're taking out gigantic chunks of property and putting them into the public realm, and that has a cost to it. And what that's generally doing is it's nudging you all to being the master developer in order to trade off to generate that public space. So I think if you're the master developer, your control on what happens kind of always lies right here. And when someone comes back and says, gosh, I've decided I'd love to buy this piece of property and put a 7-Eleven here, and I'll give you $5 million for it, you all might say, gosh, we love the $5 million, but we're not putting a 7-Eleven there, period. And so that would be one of the vehicles, and I don't know if I've missed one of the vehicles.
You know, I think that's right. I would just say also in a plan like this with a long-term, development horizon, there's a balance between being overly prescriptive and being flexible. So allowing for there to be a different interpretation. So, for example, townhouses, as we are drawing them out here, they look all the same, but there's likely going to be many, many different types. So like maybe one's 25 feet wide, maybe a less expensive one is 20 feet, maybe they're 30, maybe they're 2 stories, maybe they're 3 stories. The parking configurations are different, but I think that from an urban design standpoint, you'd want to have some cohesiveness to it, but not a lot of sameness, so that it's interesting as a place, but also allows the flexibility as the market changes. So we wouldn't want to suggest that you can predict the market exactly how it's going to be over the life of this project. That would be a mistake. So you want to be able to say, okay, we have a mechanism for revisiting these things as we get proposals on any one part, and then ask that question, does it fit with our plan? It's similar to how you interpret zoning, I would think, at the end of the day.
So just to clarify a little bit from the zoning perspective, so we still need to complete the annexation process. We took it through Planning Commission last year, and then we decided let's wait until we get a little bit more of this work done to figure out what are the uses going to be, because ultimately when it comes into the city with annexation, it'll have zoning assigned, and we wanted to ensure in an annexation agreement that we know what are the uses that we're desiring, because that's the way to kind of secure the future of the site. So we can outline in the annexation agreement, we can assign the zoning to it, and we talked about having a planned unit development as one of the components, so that we allow a little bit more flexibility, maybe with setbacks, maybe with height, maybe with the parking, allowing the uses in the shoreline area and the public space. And so that would really be part of, we would specify that in the annexation agreement and likely include the site plan or maybe variations of the site plan to really say this is what we want on the site. And then the developers would know what we're expecting, and then there wouldn't be something completely outlandish that wasn't anticipated, but still allowing for some flexibility.
So then the completion of the annexation process wouldn't occur until after the use maps are tweaked and more in line with what this discussion has been. Is that the
We
plan?
could do it either way. Annexation agreements, it could basically, we would say if we assign, we talked about before, maybe the C-17, because it's the commercial zoning, it allows all the uses, require a planned unit development, and maybe have kind of a broad plan in there, but then once a PUD comes in, if the city does that, or if that's, some outside entity creates a PUD, and then the site plan could be locked in at that point. So an annexation agreement can say you need to complete the master planning process, and then that's a second step in So we need to have further discussions on what's the strategy, what makes the most sense. But we did delay on completing the annexation until we did more of this work, so we understood what we were looking at. But we certainly, if it's the pleasure of the council to move it forward through the annexation, we can do that. All it needs is the public hearing with city council at this point and assigning the zoning and doing the annexation agreement and ordinance. So.
Isn't that critical to the developing a URD, is having it annexed into the city?
Prior to formation of the districts, yes.
Right, so that's another component, the reason why we
It has to
would
occur
complete the
before
annex.
that 90-day, or however long it takes. The annexation has to occur before, or it has to occur before the end of the completion.
Run in parallel, but it has to be done prior to council approving the expansion and creation of districts.
I'm just trying to be clear. I know that I've been approached many times on that when they say, oh, you're going to bring the whole thing in as C-17, and that's just a scary conversation because it leaves all the control of how that changes within that footprint up to, you know, the staff and the developer at that point. And so I'm just looking for things that we can discuss in advance to assure that the public can get the plan that's being proposed or have some comfort level that that's going to occur.
Right, so we can definitely work on what that looks like, how detailed the plan is, or if it just is more kind of conceptual. I think we talked about that at one point, kind of showing the mix of uses and generally assigning, especially the public area, so that was, you know, providing the assurance to the community members, and then the rest of it maybe having kind of the conceptual, but it doesn't have to be fully detailed. That could come at a later stage. And we do need to work on the timing, make sure it works well with the creation of the urban renewal district.
Okay.
Dan?
Just in the funding scheme and balance of it, pretty much I think everybody has agreed at some component is going to have to be the bond, you know, going after a geo bond on it. And it is kind of handy that the stuff that the public is going to get excited about paying for a bond is in that first phase. And pretty much, you know, and I'm looking at it from the political standpoint that, you know, if part of the funding mix, and as you figure this out, and that's what, I'm not sure how it works and on the, in the mix, but again, that if that, some of what you're worried about, like with the waterfront feature and then the park up above, rather it's ball fields, or I really kind of like that new idea, but again, if that's the bond, but you have to also figure that I think the public will support a bond for those kind of park stuff, because basically you're saying, look, we can buy this property, we're going to do it, but if you want to park, you know, in your lifetime, you're going to have to, you know, step up for that. But they won't come back later for, you know, a second bond or something for other components. So whatever we're going to do the bond for, I think it's got to be in that, and there's some, you know, ideal candidates, it seems like.
I think that that summary is really accurate, but one of the things that we would anticipate providing the council at the end of this is an option. You know, there's one option where we need to rush in and do all these things immediately. You may be faced with the bond. The other option would be if you're prepared to lightly develop the park, maybe you don't need a bond, and you would have to build these things over time. And I think as decision makers, those are things you value, because now you can kind of weight that and decide, gee, we don't do the geo bond, or you attempt to float the bond and it fails, which is a possibility. But at least you have an exit strategy that would allow you to move forward.
And there are some time constraints on how often and quick you can run the bonds.
Right. And the way that our process was set up originally when Councilmember Miller and the mayor and Tony and Troy and Hillary and I were working on the schedule, that was one of the things that was in the back of our mind, is to try to march this thing along, which is kind of even why this process is compressed, because we're trying to hit certain deadlines so Tony can do his things. And if the council were to elect to move forward with a geo bond, they have the opportunity to hit your deadlines.
Woody?
So I'm trying to grasp this whole thing. So we bought this dirt, we want to put in a cool park, and now we're going to be the developers, right? Am I on target? Have we done this before, Troy? Have we been the master dirt guys? and now we're going to tell them what they can build, and hopefully somebody comes along and wants to build it. Is that the theory here?
We have not been the developers on property like this.
Okay, so this is kind of a new for us. And I look to urban renewal. Tony, you guys kind of have done this. You've had properties and you've sold properties. You guys haven't developed properties?
The only thing we're developing now is a subdivision over there on North Park Drive. We've kind of put a subdivision and we're selling lots, but nothing on this scale.
You're frightened, Phil, maybe you maybe talk about it. It's, in my mind, it doesn't get into the detail that Park Drive is. We're not going to go in there and carve out individual lots or sell blocks to developers, and they do that. But maybe, Phil, you can talk about that.
Right, and I guess that's a good clarifying point. You see this finely chopped up into pieces, which implies you're down to the platted level. That's probably not where you would end up. Where you would end up, where you're putting in big backbone infrastructure and there's these large pads where a developer comes in and says, geez, I've decided I want to really do single family homes on this waterfront. It moves through your process that Hillary and Councilmember Miller are talking about. Gee, it still fits with our character. He really wants to do single family homes and he's prepared to pay you a price for it. Well, that's not what's shown in here. He goes in and plats them in a way that are bigger lots, and he puts single-family homes in there. So he took off a big block. Maybe he or she takes off this whole section in here and does a product that is consistent with what you need here financially, and it maintains the character, because that's the thing that is important, where you guys are in this unique position to maintain the character of the neighborhood. It has a little bit of a challenge with it. So that's one part. The other part to think about is, I think this is probably unlikely, that a developer does come along and says, gosh, I love this design so much, everything's wonderful here, it looks great, I'm prepared to build it this way, and I will give you what you need right now, and then just let me go do it. And he'll take it off your hands in one gigantic chunk. Again, I don't know that that's likely, but there's always the potential that exists that someone is so excited about this. I think in that scenario, the council and the planning department, as Hillary said, you and Councilmember Miller, you want to have enough white lines on the road that you don't have this turned into storage units.
Gotcha. But so somebody could come in and buy just one piece.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the scenario. Is that, but the reason for that, remember, is you've got to get. We keep talking about residual land value. You got to get enough property out of here to help offset the fact that you've got a big chunk of the public that you pulled out for the public, and it's got to be paid for one way or the other.
Thanks.
See Scott, and then I'll come to you, Olivia. Did you have something, Scott? Olivia, you're up.
I appreciate all of you guys' work on this and all the thoroughness. I have a question about infrastructure costs and approximate, I know it's constantly changing, so approximate costs and for phase one particularly, and public improvement costs.
So I don't know if I remember the costs off the top of our head on the phase one. Do you remember it off the top of your head? Yeah.
So these are ballpark estimates that can change, but phase one infrastructure was around 11 million, and that includes putting in the roads, grading the site, all the stuff, and then the park costs for phase one was estimated about 5 million, I believe.
That brings up another point that I should address. There's this process that we're doing here with the entire council, but just the question that Commissioner Metz just asked, there's a lot of detail that goes through there in iteration. We're not going to do that in a vacuum. There is a steering committee that's made up of Commissioner Metz and other members, council members, staff, that as we move forward, we're meeting with them tomorrow and having a discussion to get some, moving forward, here's kind of the plan of action, because we're going to have this smaller group, because there's a lot more detail that we need to talk about, and it's that level of detail as we pull those things together. And I think the mayor's vision and Chairman Hoskins' vision with putting that group together, and Councilmember Miller, is a big investment of time. And you sit here and, these meetings don't last for, we're meeting for 3 hours tomorrow, sorry. But it just takes a lot of time to go through that. And we're not going to do it in a vacuum. And I'm not sure that was clear to to everybody. Plus, there's all these things that valuable input that comes from staff, the folks like you, and we'll be talking. You'll be seeing those numbers in nauseating detail tomorrow.
Brad?
I'll just touch on a little something of what Dan said and what he said, just real briefly. But you know, this is new for us. This kind of thing's not unheard of at all for urban renewal agencies and cities and, you know, other communities. This kind of thing has been done many times. And touch a little bit on what Dan said. I agree with Dan, and I think of that old saying about build it and they will come. And you know, I keep looking at this and wondering what we can do to speed up, you know, the development of the waterfront park. And I don't want to have this wind up to be one of these things that takes 10 years and we've got bare ground out there and it's just going on and on and on, and we don't know how long the economy will be booming here. At some point there'll be an adjustment. It doesn't mean it has to be a terrible adjustment like the country went through in 08 and 09, but there'll be some kind of an adjustment at some point. So I think you could probably get a majority of the citizens that would buy into a bond issue, you know, to ramp up this waterfront development. I think they'd see the value in it. And I think you can explain to the citizens that because we're the city and we're getting public access for our community, we're taking the cream out of this project that a private developer would normally sell off. And this would be the cream along the waterfront that a developer would use for their profit. So I think they understand that we're having to try and hustle to figure out, you know, how to make the rest of this pencil out to recoup some of that money. So anyway, my point, I guess, is I'd like to look at how to, you know, what the time frame is on the waterfront development, and maybe we test the winds on a bond issue for, you know, development of at least part of the waterfront or a phase in of it or something, while, you know, we wait for the market over the next few years to absorb the rest of the property and recoup our money on the purchase of it.
Ron?
How much money is Ignite going to throw into this project, for one thing?
He just gets right to
all of it? Woody says all of it. Oh, okay.
Well, they haven't got anything yet.
And then the second thing is Dan mentioned English, and Brad just mentioned a bond election. We haven't even discussed that yet as the council. So what the hell's going on?
I'm just throwing out an idea. We're discussing.
Yeah, right.
So I guess to answer the question about Ignite it has said they're willing to partner, and that's still part of the feasibility study to see how much, and there's a lot of numbers that have to come together. And what Phil and his team are looking for now is for the council to say, in concept, we approve of moving forward. That's going to allow them to put the numbers together. That's going to allow them to work with Tony to come up with that number. If there are additional funds needed, like Brad was talking about, okay, how much is the park gonna, or the waterfront gonna cost to build? Maybe we decide we want to build all of the waterfront in phase one, and maybe that's the part that we make a decision if we go for a bond or not. So there's a lot of moving pieces there. Tony, I don't think you're prepared to answer the question about how much money, right? Today, he's not prepared for that, Ron. How much money you got?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it's easy. How much you asking for? You don't have that answer.
Yeah,
so
I have it in mind.
that's way down the road, though, and we're like the mayor said, we're very willing to partner, as we always have been.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I like this. I really do. I have some concerns, though. Okay, so funding is one, and I guess we're going to find that out, and that's going to be discovered later, and that funding will tell us whether we do a bond, which I would favor, because I think people want their waterfront access, they want their park. So I'm good for that. I do have a concern for the Urban Renewal Agency, though, because I don't want to see you guys get stuck with a lot of dirt that you can't do anything with.
Nor do we.
Yeah. And so, I mean.
That is the scary part.
I went back to talk to Hillary for a little bit, because the townhomes do concern, we don't have a lot of townhomes. And we have some that are coming in that Chad is building on Sherman. But historically, it's not something that people come here to buy. So I think that's, you're kind of rolling the dice on that with a lot of townhomes. Most people come here, families, they want single-family homes. Retired people, they don't want something that they have to walk up and down stairs. So that's something you guys got to consider if we partner with this and all of a sudden you're developing the dirt for all that residential and retail and it's not moving, because that's going to freak you guys out.
Yeah, and that's the risk that scares us. I mean, there are some real concerns here for urban renewal. Part of it's absorption, part of it's product mix, part of it's, you know, how long is this going to take? Well, absorption, I guess, takes that. So, you know, it really is frightening. I mean, we're looking at a lot of different ways, and that's why we're going through this exercise to try to find out how much risk there is, and is it something that we should be taking on the risk for?
Because it really surprised me that those homes, the properties on Park, and there's still a bunch that are still haven't sold, right? The four. I would have assumed that those things would have been bam. I mean, because that's real estate heaven down there. And that's, you know, but it didn't move, so that's frightening. And then you have this, and all of a sudden you don't have 10 parcels, you have 160.
I would actually say, Dan, though, I think, and Brad and Olivia know the market better than I do, but I would say that selling 6 out of those 10 so far is pretty good. And we've ratcheted the prices up. Our prices were more than we thought we would get out of appraisal, so 6 out of 10. Boy, I would be surprised if they're still there at the end of the summer, wouldn't you, Brad?
I think they'll be gone. And, you know, if we have trouble getting rid of the last 2 or 3 lots, we can do a little price adjustment, right? We're probably on those, no one gets the subject, but on those lots, we're maybe a little bit above what a spec builder wants to pay on them. We're more like at a homeowner price.
Right.
And we're just at the point in the market where you're going to have a lot of, you know, high net worth people coming up here this summer. They're looking for a spot to build in the foreground. So I think Steve's right. I think we'll get rid of those, and I don't think that'll be a problem. And I would just say real quick that I'm not sold on all these ideas they've got here. We're just kind of in the preliminary discussion. I'm not that hot on townhouses either. I'm not saying that'll work or not work.
Yeah, I was going to ask the mayor, because I know you do development. So what's your finger in the wind about townhomes?
Mine was the same as yours.
Okay.
But what we had tasked this team with is to build something that is different in Coeur d'Alene. So
Okay.
I believe, like you do, that a lot of people that come to Coeur d'Alene, they want their own little piece of dirt.
Private Idaho.
Right? And they don't want to be connected to anyone else with their piece of dirt.
Right.
But we've seen the townhomes on Sherman that have been developed. I've heard all 5 of those are sold, or 4 of them, however many of those are. So that, I think that's the advantage when we bring someone's eyes from the outside to come in here and look at stuff. We get a little bit of tunnel vision sometimes. Townhomes could go crazy, but you know, I'm like you, and I'm like Mick too. You really have to. We're gonna have to study the market so we get a little bit more comfort. We're never going to be 100% comfortable. That never happens. But my first reaction was similar to yours and Brad's.
But I do favor moving forward with the park. I think that part of the puzzle, I think that's the payoff for the public right now, is they're going through all this stuff and we're getting all this feedback, and I really don't want to have them hanging there too long.
Brad Scott had.
One thing that I think surprised us when we went and visited Kendall Yard, and I know that's on that side of the line, but you get that really nice community feel and the small shops and the parks and stuff, and they love that townhouse over there.
I agree.
And it's odd to us, but maybe it sells. I think we probably have to try a little bit of it.
You have to sell that to a developer, though. I mean, there's people buying those things, but you have to convince a developer to come in and do that here, and that it's going to work.
Buy it over here. So that's part of the stuff that scares us.
I don't want to get, you know, and I don't want to, at this point tonight, try to micromanage these townhouses too much, but I share your concerns. We might have a developer come in with a little bit different take on patio homes or some kind of different take on townhomes. So somehow there's something that'll work there. And I agree with you. I think the public wants open space, and I think the public would support finding a way to get this water park in and not having to wait 10 years, to be able to enjoy it. And the other thing I see is if somehow we can ramp up the time frame to get this water park in, it's going to make it so much easier to sell the rest of this land when that gorgeous water park is in there and developers and people are coming in and seeing what's there. That's a lot easier to sell all that than to have barren land there and say, well, as soon as we move some land and turn some dollars around, we're going to put a park in there. I think that's insurance on getting the rest of this land sold to recoup our money.
I'd just like to add amen to all that. To the townhouse question, yeah, I mean, I agree with all of you, but you don't remember, you're not going to be in a position where you have to divine the market's taste at any one time for a specific housing product. Your job, so you may have a block that is at its most dense, would accommodate 10 townhouses. And when that's ready, meaning you've extended infrastructure to it, you may get someone that comes in at that moment and they say, yeah, I hear your 10 townhouses. I'd really rather do, 7 small lot detached cottage product. And you may look at it and you may, planning staff looks at it and says, yeah, that's solid. The pricing's good. We like the way it's going to work. If it's within the plan, done. If it's detached. 2 years later, somebody comes in and says, I want to do, I want to do more townhouses. They want to do 3-story townhouses, not 2-story townhouses. You've got the flexibility to do that. So I don't know if that's helpful in terms of worrying about the product, but you don't have to hit it right in the middle of the target 5 years out. You just have to prepare the land plan to be flexible, and I think that's what this shows. For example, with a lot of single-family lots here, small lot, single-family, that could be 4 different, quote, product types, that builders would choose to build. Is it 1-story cottage that's got higher finishes, or is it 2 stories? Is it a 3,000 square foot compact house for, with 4 bedrooms? You don't have to know exactly. You just have to have the land ready when the market's there.
Tiny homes? No, okay.
And then another point too is that condo in North Idaho has not been popular for a lot of projects. I mean, it used to be that a lot of the condos were sold by banks because they had to take it back, right? But then Phil had explained that these are going to be smaller condo projects. These aren't going to be great, big, huge condo projects. To me, the most successful condo project is a small one that's right behind the ice plant. Art Elliott built it, and it was a 7-unit condo. The one thing that it had was it had a lot of outside deck space, outside living, which I think people love. People come to North Idaho to be outside. They don't want to be just in their condo and that's it. So it did make me feel a lot better when Phil explained that we're not talking about 80-unit condo buildings. We're talking about condo buildings that are smaller condo buildings. Go ahead, Kiki.
And I love this conversation, but the thing that I still have to go back to is what in that annexation language is going to assure that this conversation moves forward. If we're trying to be that flexible, and I'm listening what the community has told me, they're saying, how tall will you be able to build there, and how dense will it be, and the things that they were in agreement to accept. What it sounds like what we decide here today is going to leave enough flexibility that long after I'm gone or the planning director's gone, somebody else comes in and says, well, we actually think a 7-story structure that's all commercial would be a good idea because we need the money. I mean, that's really my biggest concern about how do we protect the community's vision with that annexation language. And that I don't know if there's other things that Hillary can speak to on that, and how do you, I don't want to make a decision today that leaves it so flexible that we can't come back and put the lid on that without putting the lid on the financing flexibility options too.
We can definitely work on drafting up some language, and I think it'd be prudent to have a lot of people look at that language before we come forward and say, what is it? Because you're right, we can absolutely put maximum heights in there, we could put maximum density for residential in there, but allowing for maybe, because on the numbers that we saw this evening, the residential was 9 units per acre for single family, and then it was close to 34 for some of the highest. So we could put those kind of things in there as well and kind of outline maybe maximum number of units. put some sideboards on there, but still allow flexibility. I think that would be.
And something that secures that park space and that public space within that agreement, that says this is not a negotiable piece of it at this point, and that way the public, when you do go to ask them for money, they have some assurance that they're going to get what they paid for.
I think that'd be a great way to do it. And one thing, like we talked about when I was up here earlier, is we don't know exactly what level of detail we would include in that plan if we need to come forward right away and finish the annexation process, but we certainly could outline, I think at a minimum, what's the open space, carve that out so it's clear, what everyone can expect.
Percentage-wise and waterfront. Okay, thank
And
you.
Hillary, we did some of that with the building envelopes on our Park Drive.
Right, we
'Cause
did.
We wanted some certain ways for these homes to be built, so Hillary, you had worked with Tony and Danielle and created those building envelopes for that.
And that's, another thing too that we did on those Park Drive lots, and we could do for this as well. If there's certain areas of the project we want to have alley access only and not have the driveway curb cuts, that might be important to do on some of it, because especially if there's going to be multi-use paths or other things, that might be important to specify.
Great.
One more thing, the city is going to be the original party taking title. When you convey that to Ignite, if you do, you can certainly put restrictions on the deed that say this portion 100 feet from high water mark can only ever be used for this, that, or the other. Now, that's all this, and then it will go through a public process, planning commission, ultimately city council for various approvals over time. Those can change. I mean, even if you put a restriction on now, the next person that sits in your chair, then 4 of the next people that sit there could change a lot of the rules, all the rules, basically. So you can only go so far in nailing it down, I think, well-intentioned, but the reality is there's a process, and you guys ultimately control that process.
Or whoever's in the seat.
Or whoever's in that seat,
Right.
yeah.
Good.
Wise people.
Those wise electeds. Good.
All I'd say really quick, when people are concerned about that, whether the city council is entitled to this, the city, or you deed it to the Urban Renewal Agency, we've got a pretty close working relationship with the city council. So hopefully you could trust us to make the right decisions and work with you and work with planning. And it's not, and I'd say, well, if the city doesn't buy it, think how much control you'd have if a developer would have come in and bought this whole thing. So this is a lot better than that, and I think you're going to find we have a good working relationship, and it's going to be parceled out piece by piece. It's not one whole thing, so we'll have a lot of control over what happens on it.
Any other questions? Are we going to let Dell off the hook? Doesn't anybody have a real tough question for Dell? I can't let him sit back here.
I think that's an example of the thoroughness with which Dell does
I love your
things.
colors, Del. So
Colors.
how deep do we need to get into this? I had a couple questions on all the cool streets. Do they have bike paths on them?
The streets are currently not conceived to have bike paths on them, especially our Riverfront Drive, because we have a bike path beside it. And that said, they are designed to be skinny and slow and traffic calming. So as we conceive of them right now, I don't think it's appropriate to put bike lanes on most of them. I could imagine we could start to think about, this would have large sidewalks beside. I think some of these major, if we're kind of getting to the next stage maybe of thinking about these streets, we could consider that. Maybe a few of them, it would be a good idea. But
I don't think it's a good idea.
Okay.
I just-
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, and my other question is, so is there on-street parking on that particular street?
There's on-street parking that's imagined all along the Riverfront Drive. It's in the current drawing. I'm trying to get the mouse to move here. It's on the inland or uphill side of the street, thinking that as you're driving by, and this comes from, you were there last night. I talked to some folks about other cities and other places where these things have been done. Oftentimes, there's only limited amount of parking on the waterfront side because, although we're trying to make it very walkable, very bikeable, but people drive slow, some people are going to be driving here, so that experience is good too. So that your views are open to water as you drive by. That said, we can bring some of that on-street parking back onto that side, and maybe in pockets. All of the other streets, especially where you have alleys, so we're imagining on-street parking along one side along here, because these are probably going to be driveways. You'll have a lot of curb cuts. Maybe there's some pockets for it there, but it's going to be pretty limited. All along here, there would be on these street ends. So there's actually a fair amount of on-street parking already planned throughout this concept.
Two-way, those streets all two-way or one-way?
Everything is conceived of as two-way at this point in time.
Okay, and then so where all the activity is down at the park,
Yep.
they're just for all the things you're offering, a restaurant, a theater thing, an open space, a beach. I don't see enough parking.
You don't think there's enough parking? This comment came up last night too, and I think maybe we need to study it a little bit more. One couple of thoughts on that, and there's a pool of parking up here adjacent to this open space, if some version of this was still goes forward. If it became all trails and earthworks, I guess that could change. We actually colored this a little bit incorrectly. We had in Dell's drawing, this is imagined to be parking over here as well. And then there's a pool of parking that we're thinking down here that we might add along the street here. So you're right, there's maybe not an overwhelming amount of parking right here, but within a very short walk, we were thinking there's a fair amount. I think it's something we probably need to study a little bit more as well. So it's sort of a both-and answer.
Such a concentrated, happy place,
Yes.
people have to get there.
Yes, you're gonna come up and give that. I know what you're gonna say.
So it's evolving and there's a fine line, but we're distinctly trying to create something a little bit different than what exists. So you mentioned the compact part, you're asking about the streets. The intent is that these are smaller, more intimate, rich with pedestrian amenities, so there's really nice, rigorous thought to street trees and site furnishings and ornamental pedestrian lighting. There's parallel parking. They're comfortable to bike and walk to. Everything's well connected. We talked about the loops, and there's this system that when you get here, it's actually more enjoyable and comfortable to walk around. Some of the other developments, as beautiful as they are, it's still quicker, more convenient, and comfortable because of the level of maybe less pedestrian amenity and the distances between them. It's still easier to drive around. In this case, we want something that's more comfortable to walk and bike around. So there's this, of course, people are going to come here for the big events, but we're hoping folks in the neighborhood, which includes the adjacent neighborhoods that are already there, are going to walk to and from this place, bike, and then walk to and from the development in the areas in between. Obviously, when it's snowing and raining and all those things, people are going to drive, but this gives a little bit different option and some diversity, and there might be a little emerging demographic that you're catering to over the next 20 years with this. So again, it's a fine line, but we're trying to do something a little bit forward thinking with the way we're approaching this.
Thanks.
Other questions? So Phil, this concludes your presentation?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and yes.
Okay, and then what Phil's team is looking for is they've taken it this far. They're looking for council to give them direction on if they feel that this concept is something that is agreeable. Remember, concept, there's a big difference between concept and plan, right, Phil?
Yes.
Those are two big differences. So if you agree upon this in concept, we'd like to get some council action to have them move forward to the next step, which is financial feasibility. If that approval is given tonight, Phil, and you guys go on to your financial feasibility, I would imagine you will come back, make a report to both the boards, to the city council and to the Ignite board.
Correct, and I think a lot of the discussion we've heard tonight about sideboards and just the feedback we've heard is going to get put into these documents so you guys understand the trade-offs as you have a piece of property. These are some things you'll have to worry about. But I think it was all really good. We're all kind of taking notes here about what you're telling us.
And the time frame from today until that financial feasibility presentation?
Mid-June, yeah.
June.
Yeah, so it's going to move pretty rapidly, and that's why the steering committee is going to not like the process.
Okay. So,
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the proposed site development concept and park space size development character and move forward with refining the financial feasibility as presented and authorize staff to confirm the annexation of the Bad Axe property.
Second.
we have a motion and a second. Further discussion? No further discussion. Seat. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. Anyone have anything else for the good of the order here? Tony?
I'd like to ask Chairman Hoskins to make that same motion for our board, minus the annexation part. So the motion for Ignite would be to approve the proposed site development concept and park space size development character, and to move forward with refining the financial feasibility as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion?
I would just point out, this is one of the times where somebody can legally vote twice. And that's me, sorry.
It's going to be interesting if you vote opposite. That, one thing I had is the financial feasibility study will come back and there'll be a proposals to complete that, I'm assuming? Or is that part of already the?
Part of the deal.
We'll be seeing a lot of numbers. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll be seeing the numbers, yeah.
All in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed?
So
That
Dan
motion
voted the
carries.
same way twice.
Move to adjourn?
Wait, I just wanted to thank Phil. Phil has worked long and hard on this. His team, his Seattle team, what a great, smart group of people. Thank you very much for the work you've done so far. Really crunch those numbers. We're going to be looking forward to seeing those. Oh, aren't we, Ron? We want to see those numbers. And then I want to thank Del Hatch too. Del put a lot of work. I love his mill pond. I hope we can afford it.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
So, what do you have, a motion to adjourn?
To adjourn, yeah.
We have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Take a motion to adjourn also.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.